Um, I'm Carly Thompson. I am with Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition, where I work as the climate education and grants specialist. And I'm super excited to have Baratha Tan here today. Baratha is here with us with his lovely black fuzzy cat, I see. Um, Baratha is with Vote Solar, which is a nonprofit that advocates for policies that accelerate the clean energy transition. He works there as the senior regulatory manager for the Midwest. He and his team are responsible for work guiding regulatory policies that provide more equitable access to solar. And he also participates in regulatory processes around distributed generation and grid equity. So doing that work right here in our region. He came to this work before he was working in policy. He was working as an engineer for Ford Motor Company on hybrid and EV vehicles. So he did a bachelor's in mechanical engineer at Villanova and then went on to pursue a master's in public policy at U of M. Born and raised in Philadelphia, but now he's our neighbor over in Detroit. So we welcome you, Baratha, and thank you for being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the intro, Carly. Um, I would like to spend probably between 20 and 30 minutes at most just going through this presentation, and then we could reserve the second half of the meeting for all types of Q&A. I will go through just talking about data centers, generally speaking, just to capture the scope of what we mean by data centers, and then provide a specific example of ChatGPT slash OpenAI. That is a specific company that you might have heard in the news recently regarding a huge contract that they signed with DTE, and then kind of give a quick scope of some of our neighboring states and what's happening in those states. As Carly mentioned, I work at Volt Solar. Here's just quick blurb here. We'll just skip through that very quickly. The biggest thing to note is that we are a nonprofit. We are not a trade industry. Um, so some people might think that we work with all the companies that make the solar. We do not. We focus on making sure that people have equitable access to renewable energy. And especially, even before we talking about putting rooftop solar on people's homes, if the grid is not fair or equitable, and if the utilities do not work fairly in providing equal service, then we have to tackle that problem first. As I mentioned, we'll go through the quick basics of data centers from my perspective. We'll go through a quick example of ChatGPT, one of the more popular artificial intelligence, quote unquote, artificial intelligence programs that people hear about. We'll look at our neighboring states, quick discussion on what I think we should consider here in Michigan, and then straight to Q&A. So the basics, some of you might already have done a lot of research into data centers or not, so hopefully I could just breeze through this very quickly. Um, Data centers here, when I talk about data centers, it's these huge infrastructure, huge buildings that are used to power artificial intelligence, number one, but data centers also are used to store people's photos, documents. They are used as quote unquote cloud services. People use it to access music and a lot more things. Data centers essentially stay running all the time because of this idea of convenience. If I'm waking up in the morning and say I want to turn on Spotify and listen to a bunch of music, data centers have to stay on for that. If I'm working very late into the night writing a document on Google Drive, data centers have to stay on for that. When we go back and talk about quote unquote artificial intelligence, all of these software programs that people use to ask questions or create fake art and fake pictures and fake videos, data centers are like the brains of artificial intelligence, of AI, and the data centers have to stay on so that the AI can be used to answer those questions to create these fake artworks to train themselves. So if we want to think of data centers kind of like a huge, big supercomputer, if you're keeping them on all the time, they get warm and get very hot. That means that water and electricity usage is very high. Um, there is a caveat. There are a couple of different types of data centers that use air cooling instead of water cooling. Air cooling is not as efficient as water cooling. And because it's less efficient, you need to run the fan a lot more, which means that you're using a lot more electricity. So there's like a catch 22 there. So let's quickly go into an example of ChatGPT. I will be the first to admit that when ChatGPT first came out, I definitely was one of those people that used it for a little bit just to see and figure out what's going on there. Definitely don't like it, as well as all of the other artificial intelligence programs out there. So I want to dive in very quickly into the electricity and the water use for ChatGPT. When we're looking at the electricity use, for every 100 words, it uses 0.14 kilowatts. 0.14 kilowatts is about, a high performing laptop. And we're talking about 100 words, just on average. But if you calculate ChatGPT being used for one day throughout the entire world, it uses close to 39.98 million kilowatt hours, which is roughly about 40 gigawatt hours, charges 8 million cell phones, or it can be used to power the entire Empire State Building in New York City for 540 days. With ChatGPT running for 1 month, that's about 1.1 terawatt hours. It can charge 332,000 EVs from 0 to 100%. Or you could use that same amount of electricity to power all of the Times Square billboards in New York City for about 20 years. And in 1 year, ChatGPT is estimated to use 14 terawatt hours. And that is about 117 countries around the world in 1 year. And these 117 countries are primarily in South America, Africa, and parts of Asia. So that's a lot of electricity. Um, I didn't put this in here, but if you look at ChatGPT's electricity use for 1 week, that is equal to 4 Super Bowls, including all of the TVs and the cable boxes that everyone uses to watch the Super Bowl. Just wanted to mention that. Unfortunately, even though the Lions aren't in the playoffs, some people might be thinking about the Super Bowl. So just think 1 week of ChatGPT equals all of the electricity used for 4 Super Bowls. Turning our attention to water use. If we look at just an average of 100 words, it's about 519 milliliters of water or 17-ish ounces. I have a little uh, thermos here. This is 10 ounces. So think of something like this plus almost another full thermos that I'm using here to drink water. If we expand that out to one day, that's equivalent to about 39.16 million gallons of water, equivalent to an average of 978,000 bathtubs. San Jose is estimated to have around 978,000 residents. So, just thinking to ourselves, oh, every resident in San Jose can get a bath for one day of ChatGPT use. For 1 month, the amount of water equals close to 1,780 Olympic-sized pools, or everyone on the planet gets 2 glasses of water. In 1 year, it's 14 billion gallons of water, which is equivalent to filling New York City's Central Park 14 times. And just as a side note, I'll send this presentation out to Carly if you're interested in checking out the citation. So with all this being said, looking at ChatGPT as an example, we see that there's a lot of electricity use and a lot of water use. You could only imagine the amount of electricity and water that's being used for the other huge AI programs, such as the one that Google owns, such as the one that Elon Musk owns, all of these other AI softwares. So, taking a step back and kind of coming back to the region, let me just give a quick overview of some of our Midwest neighbors and what's happening over there regarding data centers. Indiana, our neighbors to the south. Some of us might have seen in the news, yes, last year, Amazon's largest data center just opened up at the end of last year in southern Indiana. It's about 1,200 acres of land. It cost $11 billion. And at once they're running at full capacity, they will be using 2.2 gigawatts of electricity, equal to 1.6 million Hoosier homes. That is a lot. And at the end of last year, Amazon also announced another $4 billion investment in building another data center there. So that's two huge data centers. A couple of other things to note in Indiana, there are proposed state bills to fast track DC approvals, data center approval, sorry. Um, but it still kept in various air and water permits that data centers have to apply for. But the fundamental idea is Indiana passed a fast tracking data center approval bill. They also proposed a couple of state bills to study the impacts of data centers, not necessarily having any requirements or accountability attached to those bills, just bills saying study the impact of data centers. And then one more thing that I unfortunately am shouting at the rooftops about, Duke Energy Indiana, one of the bigger electric utilities in the state, they have been approved to sell their coal plants to third parties. And I note this because there's a realistic chance that if a huge technology company, like say Meta or Facebook, for example, is desperate enough to get their data centers online, they could buy these coal plants and immediately hook it up to their own data centers, keeping the coal plants alive. And we don't even have to go into the environmental impacts and the health impacts regarding keeping coal plants open. I'm sure, all of you know about the J.H. Campbell coal plant and how that's being kept alive and still polluting the environment. Next up in Minnesota, also not the best news there either. In 2025, the state legislature did pass a data center bill. It does create certain fees for huge data centers, upwards to a couple $1 million, depending on how much energy they use and how big a footprint they are. But they do extend other data center tax breaks for 35 more years. So it's kind of like we'll add these fees here, but we'll make sure that a bunch of your taxes that you are guaranteed to get credit for, we'll just keep that in place. And there are also soft protections around water. So unfortunately, a lot of environmental groups there in Minnesota tried their best to keep strict protections around water and land in, and the language there was all softened. There is one data center that I want to note to everyone. In southern Minnesota, there was a data center proposed last year at the cost of $4 billion, and this data center is estimated to use power equivalent to 1 million Minnesota homes. So we're talking a lot of energy as well. And then finally, turning to our step sibling in Illinois that I like to make fun of once in a while. Uh, in Illinois, there were some bills, data center specific bills, that were stalled in 2025. All of these data center bills that were stalled had some environmental protections and some residential protections, but no one liked those bills. Only the data centers liked those bills. So it was a good thing that these bills were stalled. There's some fun facts about Illinois. Illinois is a little bit more unique. They have a lot of data centers right now. Currently, um, we are estimating that by next year, data centers alone would increase Chicago residents' monthly bills by $70. The Chicago utility, ComEd, or Commonwealth Edison, expects 29 terawatt hours of data centers to come online by 2040. But as I noted there at the last bullet point, Chicago residents only use 20 terawatt hours of electricity annually, which means that if ComEd and if the data centers do bring all of this demand online by 2040, the amount of energy the data centers use will outweigh all of the Chicago residents and Chicago area residents, I should say. Moving on to things that I think we should consider are things that we should keep in mind. Yes, unfortunately, it's a very long list of bullet points. I apologize. State and local officials have power. Some local municipalities voted to deny data centers, and unfortunately, some did. And then, there are other local officials who signed non-disclosure agreements and passed data center permits. As we've seen here in Michigan, state officials can pass data center bills. Unfortunately, here in Michigan, they passed tax-friendly bills for data centers. But state officials can pass strict environmental siting and energy requirements for these data centers. Here in Michigan, the Public Service Commission has limited power, but as we've seen in some news recently regarding DTE and OpenAI, um, signing a contract in trying to build a data center in Saline Township, the Michigan Public Service Commission approved that. So that's just something I wanted to note that the Public Service Commission does have some power, but there's a lot of caveats and a lot of things that we have to dive deeper into. Um, Regarding community benefit agreements, we can get into that in Q&A, but enforceable community benefit agreements are very important. They need to be pursued actively because to me, this is kind of like the stopgap, last second measure that we can do to make sure that we do the best we can to protect our communities. And someone mentioned earlier the Michigan Climate Action Network. I listed here some organizations to contact for more details regarding data centers or organizing around fighting data centers or understanding effective pathways to challenge data centers. Michigan Climate Action Network, or MICAN, as mentioned earlier, they have kind of like a crash course on data centers specifically. The Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition and Citizens Utility Board both also are looking at how to effectively bring people together in organizing and challenging data centers that want to come to Michigan. A couple of other things to keep in mind when we look at our neighbors. In Illinois, the stalled state bills show us that the state lawmakers are vulnerable to organizing. The grassroots and various state organizations there have been very effective in making sure that those data center friendly bills were not pushed further. And also in Illinois, the Utility Commission there, their version of the Public Service Commission, has been tasked by the state government through bills to look at data center spending and energy use. In Minnesota, the flip side happened where the state lawmakers passed weak data center bills, even though a lot of organizing has been there. So there could be some lessons learned on what's effective, what's not. And there have been quite a few local officials there in various townships who signed non-disclosure agreements and voted to allow data centers to build in people's backyards. So again, something else that we can think about. In Indiana, it's the Wild Wild West for now. Increasingly, there have been a lot of organizing around people's increasing electricity bills. And this has just been very, very recent in the last few months. And I believe there actually was like a documentary that was published like within a month. It might have been through Vice, looking at this Amazon data center that I mentioned earlier and how people didn't realize it was happening until after it was turned on. So again, a lot of information that I threw out at everyone, from just talking about data centers generally very quickly to looking at what our neighbors are doing and then talking about things that I think we should keep in mind here.
Okay, well, I have a number of questions, actually. I don't want to dominate the discussion, but first of all, you mentioned only sort of personal kinds of activities that rely on data centers, like watching YouTube or doing email, whatever. Um, isn't it also the case that most or all of our economic activity relies also on data centers?
I can't speak to the nation's economic reliance, although data centers essentially, yes, and software, because we're so reliant on computers generally, that it is a backbone. Um, I would say that colloquially speaking, the automotive sector, for example, is still like one of the top industries in the state of Michigan. And being a former Ford person, I'm sure they'll survive if, say, for example, we kick all the data centers out. But yes, you are correct in saying that data centers are very key to our economy. Yeah. And
As
in
well as our
defense, unfortunately, as well. Like artificial intelligence and data centers are used to keep records of people, whether in the US or outside. Artificial intelligence is increasingly being used on training drones to drop bombs and things like that. So it's not just our economy, it's also being intertwined very deeply into our federal government.
Sure. How about Steve?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for all of this. And this may be a really simple-minded question, but you know, I mean, the data center data, our reliance on data, that train has left the station, right? And so we're left with sort of managing it in an equitable way. But fundamentally, I don't understand um, what the advantage is to a community that agrees to put one of these things in their space, right? They get higher electricity bills, more water usage. They likely got some huge tax break to locate, and they hire, they employ maybe 10 people to run the data center. So what is the attraction? What is the incentive for, say, Kalamazoo to put a data center here? What is the argument that people can make to put a data center in a specific location?
Putting community benefit agreements to the side, I think the costs outweigh the benefits. So, like you said, Steve, in terms of just looking at people's electricity bills, um, and in return, getting maybe 10 jobs that very likely might be minimum wage jobs because all you have to do is just make sure that the data center, various parts of the data center rooms stay on and things are working. I think without a community benefits agreement, the costs will always be worse.
So tell us about these community benefit agreements.
Yes. I would say Minnesota's the furthest along, and I could send a couple of links as well to Carly to share with everyone afterwards. The idea is, uh, generally speaking, you force these companies to get into a room with the community organizers, community leaders, and actually say, if you want to build here, here are the community's demands. For example, we could demand Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, if they want to come to Kalamazoo, spend minimum $50 million to upgrade all of the infrastructure for us at no cost. Build community centers for our children and our retired citizens. Uh, sign as part of this benefit agreement. Guarantee that we have 200 jobs that are well paying, that have guaranteed benefits such as health benefits, retirement benefits, X, Y, and Z. And then in terms of enforceable, unfortunately, I haven't seen an example of CBAs being enforceable from a court standpoint, other than it's a contract, and any huge company could just choose to leave and then pay a small fee. Ford, the automotive industry has shown that time and time again, moving their assembly factories left and right, depending on if they feel petty enough. Um, so when I talk about community benefits agreements is with some political backing with your local officials, forcing these companies to come and sit down with you all, for example, and forcing them to guarantee all of these monetary or social agreements that they have to build things out, that they have to actually guarantee X amount of jobs with Y amount of salary, that all of these things that they have to build alongside the data center will benefit the community.
Thank you. Larry?
I want to add to Steve's comment before I get to my main question. I think stating some of that differently, the big thing that could be attractive to communities, even with tax reductions, is that there are large amounts of taxes with these very, very expensive facilities. And fortunately, not all communities are being bought on this, but we're talking about taxes that could pretty much satisfy most of the public needs for small communities. Saline Township comes to mind. I haven't seen public disclosure, but there's a lot of money in it for these municipalities. The big question I want to discuss is climate change. After all, this session is sponsored by Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition. There's been reference to Michigan Climate Action Network. Climate change is an issue that should be forefront, but is hardly being mentioned in all these discussions about data centers. Right now, electricity usage for data centers is about 4% of our national usage and rapidly increasing. We were making a little bit of progress in reducing our country's electricity usage. We've lost that progress. We're now going backward. I don't need to tell you all what climate change is like and how that's bad for our world and our health. I think there is a principled response based on this concern about climate change, which sometimes goes by the acronym BYONCE, Bring Your Own New Clean Energy. My feeling is that every community and every climate advocate should be insisting that data centers bring their own new clean energy. That is a huge ask. We're not likely to achieve it. Maybe we will in some places, but it's a well-principled ask, and I hope it will get big companies to the table to acknowledge the climate setbacks that go with the data centers and see what they can do about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. And to add on to that, the 2023 Michigan Clean Energy Law that was signed by the governor, there are unfortunate off-ramps that utilities can claim to delay their transition away from fossil fuel energy generation. And unfortunately, with all these data centers wanting to come to Michigan, that is a prime excuse for DTE and Consumers Energy to say, "Hey, look at all these data centers. Aside from all of the investments that will be needed, we don't think that we can make our clean energy commitments anymore. We're going to activate these off ramps, and that's a big concern."
Susan?
Yes, thank you. Economist Paul Krugman argued a few weeks ago that this huge buildup of data centers with all these negatives, with all the issues for ChatGPT using so much more resources, when a Google search for a tiny fraction of those resources gives you a better answer, the whole garbage in, garbage out argument. And again, just the overbuild up, the competition between the ChatGPT and its competitors and all that. And is there going to be one big winner? Arguments like that, thinking that this is going to be a bubble. This is propping up our whole financial, side of the economy right now. And, have you seen any other analyses, perhaps that one or by others, suggesting that maybe this will to some extent kind of go away because it's not a sustainable model in many respects?
For AI specific things, I have not seen, and Volt Solar has not seen any other research around it being so bad for so long that it'll go away. Although I agree, and I'm hopeful for that side of argument myself. Mainly, not just from the garbage in, garbage out. You're training artificial these language learning models, crappy stuff, but also just the fundamental moral questions that come out of if these artificial intelligence machines are capable of taking away white collar jobs in the future, what does that spell, from a moral perspective around like the right of work, the dignity of workers, and workers' rights. I am very concerned about that aspect that not too many people have dug deep into yet, at least from me looking at it.
Catherine?
Um, so yes, thank you for hosting this, and it's good to have regular conversations about all of the implications. Um, I would say that I share all the concerns that have been raised so far about the explosion of interest in data centers. What concerns me are the issues that have been mentioned already in terms of energy overuse, the off ramps made available to the investor owned utilities for evading the limitations on the Healthy Climate Plan, the prospect for communities perhaps being sold a pig in the poke to invest all of this or to divert resources for the development of data centers. So I think the question that I come to it with, partly as someone in leadership with Third Act Michigan, is what are we going to do politically to push back against this? There's just a national wave of opposition to data centers at this point. Yes, of course, people realize, I think, that the cloud is necessary, but the kind of mega demand that's being discussed with introducing it for the sake of operating AI and often with questionable goals in terms of expanding the surveillance state. All of these things are really giving me pause, and the pushback, I think, needs to continue to be strong and focused and determined. So not really much of a question, I'm sorry. But I do want to make sure to be able to connect with people as we go forward here. So that's probably my question. Where do we go
Thank you
next?
so much, Catherine. I agree from a political standpoint. Uh, Again, looking at Illinois, state lawmakers stopped pushing for these data center friendly bills because of the very effective, from my perspective, very effective organizing on the ground in pushing back these state lawmakers. Um, Here in Michigan, we have to make sure to keep an eye, one, on our local officials. If there's any rumors or any news of potentially data centers showing up, that we immediately contact our local officials to make sure that they don't sign any NDAs. Because the moment they sign an NDA, we're like, oh, it's crap. It's too late. The data center's already, Facebook or Elon has already gotten to them. Might have, not saying that they got money, but there might have been some sort of incentive to get them to vote yes to build these data centers. Um, and yeah, I would say Michigan, MyCan Michigan Climate Action Network, um, for now, seems to be the best place to connect with a lot of other people throughout the state who are trying to figure out what types of political strategies are effective for them, and what things can we learn here in Kalamazoo, for example.
Yes, thanks. Sorry to jump in again, but then that's a perfect opportunity for me to boost the Michigan Money Out of Politics campaign, which I think is really going to be critical to clamp down on the distorted influence that the investor-owned utilities in particular have over the whole political process. So if you're not already connected with Mop Up Michigan, anyone on the call, I urge you to do so.
I want to just piggyback on that quick with an interruption that both Third Act and the Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition are part of a steering committee for the Michigan Climate Action Network. And so you can also connect through us. But I want to lift up that network across the state that's building as a great resource for this and other climate related things statewide.
Right. Thanks, Jenny. Third Act isn't strictly speaking part of that steering committee. We're just honored to be participating in the fellows program. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
That's good stuff. I'm going to read one from the chat and then we'll go Nikki, Tom, Tim. So in the chat, Sandy asks, what does the community impact look like if a data center closes down, like in the event of an AI bubble burst?
Those few jobs that we mentioned earlier, the 10 or so jobs that are just there to make sure the data center is running, maybe the 2 or 3 security guards that are also paid minimum wage, those jobs will go away. In terms of environmental impacts, at the very least, that means that they're not using the water or electricity anymore, but all of the infrastructure that is built out. So say, for example, ChatGPT builds this, instead of Saline Township, they choose Kalamazoo. All of the electric infrastructure needed to power this data center, DTE will go to you, or Consumers Energy will go to you and say, ChatGPT's bankrupt, but we built this out anyway. So everyone here needs to foot this $5 billion bill for all of the wire substations and poles that we put in order to power this utility. And if we can't get it out from you, we'll just make sure to spread this amongst everybody in the rest of Michigan. So that's the immediate things that I can see. And of course, if you have such a huge, if it's anywhere close to the Amazon data center in Indiana, like say 1,000 acres, well, it's just a building that's just going to start to rot. 1,000 acres wasted.
Nikki?
Yeah, a couple of different points. I wrote to our state legislatures about data centers and said that I think they should be limited to industrial centers because of the noise that they can be generating, that they should be renewable energy, that they should be paying for the infrastructure that they're putting into the electrical grid so that it does not fall on the regular consumer because it's specific to what they want. And also the last thing was that they should all be air cooled. If they're building a renewable energy structures for the building, then they can also make sure that they are generating enough electricity to cover air cooling. Water is a precious commodity. We're wasting it constantly, and we have to stop all water usage for data centers. So that was one aspect of it, and I can't remember what the other aspect of it. Oh, the bubble. .com had a big bubble, but .com recovered from the big bubble because everybody uses it. And that's what's going to be happening also with AI. If you read about AI, you read factually about it or you read science fiction about it, AI is here for the future. It's going to have some drastic effects on jobs. If we don't have a guaranteed minimum income, we're not going to have an economy. And so I'm not so afraid of the bubble as much as I'm afraid of what AI is going to be doing to our future. And data centers are needed for everything with the cloud. It's not just AI. So as we continue to grow our computer usage, whether or not we have AI, we're going to need data centers. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you for that, Nikki, and thank you for being patient as we try to get through all of the hands. Totally agree on all of your points. As a side note, some of you might have heard of a new movement that's trying to come out, trying to be popularized, called the degrowth movement. Essentially challenging, like, with all the stuff that we have right now, why do we need to keep on, quote unquote, growing? Not to put my own opinions into it, but what could a world look like if we were to have all of the data centers that have already been built to just keep on using those instead of building more, or only building when really, really required, as long as we put the moral and ethical guardrails on AI in place, not just from a worker standpoint, but from an environmental standpoint as well. And going along with your water comments, looks like Kate put in a question regarding Nestle, one of the big bads in the state here. With Despite me trying to spook everyone about the water usage of ChatGPT, you can only imagine the similar amounts of water being used for all of the other AI related stuff, all the other AI related software, as well as data centers that are specifically for cloud services and storing all of your data. Um, I More research. I haven't found any research yet on how quickly groundwater in Michigan can be replenished. Because, if the data centers unfortunately also want to use the cleanest water because they don't want their uh, hardware to be corroded or anything. So they essentially have to use drinkable clean water, which will be taken out from the ground or from a water utility that will supply it, versus, say, tapping straight from the Great Lakes. So how quickly can water be replenished in our groundwater? Versus how much water are these data centers pulling out? I think
The
that's
West and the
a big question.
Midwest were drying up because they kept taking out the water without considering the future use.
Right.
Michigan, for some reason, just because they're next to the Great Lakes, thinks it's infinite. That they never lived out west. They never understood water usage as a scarce commodity. And so Michiganders have a weird look at water as far as the rest of the world is concerned.
Yeah.
Tom?
Well, I'm wondering, thank you, Baratha. This has been really interesting. And I've got a zillion questions, but I'm only going to ask one. Given that these data centers have a vast amount of rooftop, and some of them have a vast amount of acreage around them, have you done the numbers on whether solar with batteries could ever possibly power them without drawing anything from the grid? Has anybody done this?
My nonprofit might have some internal numbers that we played around with, so I'll try to see if we could find that. If we go and look at the DTE Saline Township data center, part of that agreement is the data center agreeing to pay for batteries equal to the amount of energy that the data center will use. The data center is slated to be using about 1.4 gigawatts of electricity, and they are promising to build the same number, 1.4 gigawatts of battery storage. Of course, the question mark there is no one's talking about how to power or how to fuel up those batteries. So you can only imagine, DTE in the near future could say, well, we have to charge up these batteries and we need to keep our Monroe coal plants open. So let's do that. And I think this ties into what Larry mentioned earlier very well. As we also need to think about from a state level, how can we push for state legislators to pass a bill that essentially tells data centers to bring to pay for, to install, and to use renewable energy, which unfortunately in the Midwest, no one has done that yet. No one has passed a bill yet that says that explicitly.
Tim?
You mentioned the legislation that has already passed in the Michigan legislation. Sorry, legislate sure that provides tax breaks for data centers. More recently, legislation has been introduced, not yet passed in committee or in the legislature. I think that seeks to rescind some of those tax breaks and other matters. And that's all of the the details I have on mind at the moment. But if you look at last week's Climate Change News Digest, which is in the KCCC newsletter for December 31st, there is an article which describes this legislation which has been introduced.
Thank you for mentioning that, Tim. I totally forgot about it. A representative here in Southeast Michigan, Representative Dylan Wegela, I know he's one of the folks putting his face on it 100%. Someone could remind me, the bill that was passed for these tax credits was co-sponsored by Joey Andrews, the Democratic representative on St. Joseph's, I think. So you could, just for me mentioning that there might be an interesting internal political question that might come up. Representative Wegela is Democratic and Joey Andrews is Democratic. So who knows, internally if there's some sort of interesting things going on there. Which is to say, contact your local representatives to make sure that we want this repeal to happen. And this is from me saying it, not vote solar. This is me as a fellow Michigander.
And Tim looks like he has another question.
Thanks. I'm very mystified about the proportion or role that AI plays in the use of data centers. Now, first of all, is it true that not all data center activity relates to AI? Number one, and number two, have you any idea at all of the proportion of data center activity that is devoted to AI, and particularly also who is it that's using the AI services of data centers?
To answer your first question, you are correct. Not all data centers serve artificial intelligence or these language learning models. Because these are private for-profit companies, they are really good at hiding a lot of the information around the data centers that they own, and what they use them for, whether it's the big Googles and Microsofts or Elon Musk's, but also some of the smaller data centers as well. So unfortunately, no one knows exactly what the proportion is. Although I would say that it's very likely that, for example, Amazon, who owns a lot of cloud software and owns their own small AI that they're testing out, they might be utilizing all of their data centers throughout the country in doing both. It's just segmented for example, the Indiana data center might be 60% of it might be just for training their artificial intelligence, and the rest of the 40% would be for their cloud software. No one knows, but I expect that there are a decent amount of data centers out there that do that.
Larry?
Hi, I want to introduce the terms clean AI and dirty AI. I don't think it's possible for our society to avoid using AI, but when we have the choice of using AI or when we're dealing with companies that are going to use AI, I think an appropriate question for us to be asking is, can you make it clean AI, meaning powered by sustainable energy? I also wanted to respond to a question a short while ago about solar panels on roofs and grounds. Yes, we should advocate that. We should be advocating lots of solar panels in lots of places, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. Solar panels on the roofs and grounds of a data center would supply only a teeny portion of the power needed by that data center. Keep in mind that very large data centers use a significant fraction of the power used by an entire state in some cases. And we're talking about many square miles, many of solar panels.
We'll let Tim close us out with one last good question.
Well, and it's more a comment than a question. I just want to emphasize data centers are not things unto themselves. They're there to provide services to all of us, and particularly to our economy. So when you're talking about regulating their activities, which is absolutely necessary, keep in mind that this relates to regulating economic activities, which we need to do in many ways, because that's where the greatest source to our climate of threats to our climate comes from. End of rant. Thank you.
Baratha, are there other things that we should know before we go back into this world where we're hearing about data centers in the news and hearing about them being cited potentially in communities that we live in?
Thank you all for having me in this short hour. As we can see, there's so many questions that can go all types of ways. From the economic standpoint, from the environmental standpoint, as you can see, I am very fascinated about workers' rights and how that relates to us, and how can we make AI work for us in an equitable way, in a clean way, and not a dirty way, without sacrificing our communities. So we'll have to take it, unfortunately, one step at a time.
Yeah. Okay, we appreciate you very much, and we hope to see all of you back here in a month for our next climate conversation.